So, I've thought for a while about how to approach reviews on this channel. Doing a whole video just to review one new release doesn't really feel right to me. It works well for retrospectives, but I don't really feel like it suits me for talking about new games. So instead, I'm gonna do several reviews in one video, simply because this is what I think is the best way to do video game reviews. I'm an old-fashioned guy who looks back at print game magazines with fondness. I want these to not just serve as opinions on games you already knew about and probably already had an opinion on, but I also want to highlight a selection of games and maybe get you interested in titles you weren't considering before. This is a game I've been looking forward to for years, basically since From Software finished Dark Souls 3, mentioned that there were 3 projects in the works, and wouldn't deny that one of them was Armored Core 6. I love the series, and this was easily my most anticipated game of the year, but that also made me a little worried I might overhype it in my head. So, is this game the best Armored Core game ever? No, probably not. Probably not even my favorite. I think I still prefer Nexus and Last Raven. But Armored Core 6 didn't need to be the best game in the series. It just needed to be a good reboot that could appeal to both old and new fans. And to do that, I think there's 3 things it needed to do, and 3 things that it accomplished. First, get the customization just right. Armored Core has always had customization that could be overwhelming. It's both one of the things most likely to turn off new players, but also one of the most beloved parts among fans. So the game had to make this customization more comprehensible without just making it simpler. And I think they succeeded at that. For one, there are a lot more big, varied choices. Weapons, and especially melee weapons, are far more diverse than they've ever been. At the same time, there are still plenty of stats to optimize your choices around, but they're presented in a way that makes them vastly easier to understand compared to the older games. While yes, there's some areas where there are missing customization options, those mostly belong in the nitpick section. They got the core of the customization right. The second thing is, of course, to make the game fun to play. I mean, I know this part is subjective, but I really liked it. The controls are fantastic, and while the sense of weight isn't quite there like it was in some of the older titles, instead we get extremely responsive controls that always made me feel like I have perfect control over my AC. The combat itself, meanwhile, is fun and technical as it should be. Thanks to a new recharge delay, energy management is as important as ever, and the newly emphasized stagger system provides a great deal of depth and really adds to the tempo of combat. The game really feels like a greatest hits of past Armored Core titles, and the way the areas are designed further enhances the combat. They remind me a lot of Sekiro's areas, in fact. You have distinct combat arenas, but they're typically very wide open to allow the battle to be approached as you see fit. And the third thing they really needed to do for Armored Core 6 is to make it unique. I don't think they could have made a successful game by just making another third-generation game. Putting aside that many new players might not click with it, I feel like trying to do so would never really appease the old fans either. Whether it be the greater weapon variety contributing to greater customization, the new gameplay features making for a whole new style of Armored Core battle, or the fact that the game has easily one of the best stories in the franchise, Armored Core 6 does plenty to stand out. If it's not your favorite, that's fine, it isn't mine either, but there are unique reasons to play Armored Core 6 that no other Armored Core game provides, and I think that's possibly the most important thing for it to do. However, with all this said, there is one thing that I think could genuinely be a problem with this game, and that's the boss battles. These have some issues, and I think if there's anything that turns a decent number of players off, it'll be these. Now, I do like difficult games myself, so for me, the bosses were usually a nice challenge once I found my groove, but I know not everyone is. But besides being a barrier to entry in a way that I don't think From Software normally intends the hard parts of their games to be, there are some other issues with these bosses as well. The first is the form their difficulty takes. Bosses deal a ton of damage, often taking out half of your health or more in a single attack, depending on your build, and sometimes they can even just flat out combo you to death. Meanwhile, your attacks can only slowly chip away at bosses. Because of this, these boss fights feel like long slogs where you have to play nearly perfectly for a protracted period or it's back to a checkpoint. While this kind of boss worked in From Software's other games like Dark Souls, here it just feels like a strange change of pace. And this is also where the newer systems start to feel forced into the game instead of like natural evolutions of the series. The stagger system basically seals your fate if you get staggered at a bad time, while it's about the only way that you can get a decent amount of damage onto bosses. And the boss fights sometimes feel like the repair system exists just for them, with how critical it is to surviving more than one hit. The other issue with the boss fights is the frequency, especially early on. The game pummels you with boss after boss at the point where you're least prepared to it, whether it's due to still coming to grips with the game's mechanics, or just not having sufficiently customized your AC. There's one stretch where over the course of 4 missions you fight 3 bosses. If you do not like the bosses but are otherwise willing to put up with them here and there, this just feels like the game trying to wear you down. But while the bosses are the only real complaint I have, there are a number of nitpicks I could make, but I don't really want to waste too much time on them, so I'll just put them up on screen here. Because none of these are that important. While I do think that these are all ways in which the game could be improved, they are, after all, nitpicks. New players that don't know Armored Core normally has these things probably wouldn't notice anything is missing. And furthermore, these are pretty much all things that could easily be fixed in a sequel, if not in DLC. Armored Core 6 is a fantastic game. Maybe not the best Armored Core title, but it didn't need to be. It needed to be a fresh start and a solid foundation for the future, much like Armored Core 1 was back in the day. What we have is a great mech game for new players and veteran fans alike. And if this style of mech appeals to you and you're not daunted by the difficult boss fights or complex customization, well, this is one of the best mech games on the market. My biggest hope is just that we see more Armored Core games like this one, or at very least a solid expansion pack. I want to see this be built upon game after game until we have something that can rival the 3rd generation titles. But until that happens, I'm just glad Armored Core is back, and I'm glad it's finally getting the recognition it always deserved. Lies of P feels kind of like the game From Software could have made instead of Elden Ring. It's certainly one of the less original Souls-likes out there, but that doesn't mean it isn't distinct. It borrows heavily from Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, while sprinkling in just enough of its own to make things enticingly new. And honestly, that's just what I need, a new Souls-like to learn. First, the combat. Like many of the best Souls-likes, combat places a good emphasis on defense in a way that gives you meaningful options in combat. You can block, which lets some damage through but is easy to do, and even lets you recover some of it by attacking, similar to Bloodborne. You can evade, which can completely avoid damage and put you in an advantageous position, but requires more precise timing and knowledge of the enemy attacks. And you can perfect block, which is the hardest to pull off and often leads to a regular block or just getting hit if you screw it up, but completely negates damage while pushing the enemy closer to a stagger. Making defense engaging is vital in these kinds of games, and they succeed. Once you adjust, you'll be making split-second decisions on how to best deal with every incoming attack. Of course, offense is just as satisfying. Weapons are varied and rarely simple. You have a combination of light, heavy, and charged attacks, along with variants when sprinting or dodging for your primary moveset. Of these, many weapons also have at least one attack that does a bit more too, such as the Booster Glaive's charged attack letting you throw yourself at enemies, or how the heavy attack on the Rapier gives you a backstep. There's also two Fable Arts, which are special attacks linked to the blade and handle of your weapon that consume a meter that you fill by attacking. On top of all this, your character has a mechanical left arm that can mount a variety of special weapons. These are fueled by their own separate meter and are quite varied, although upgrades for them are a little sparse. As for the enemies you'll be fighting, they're mostly fairly well designed, though admittedly there's not too many standouts outside of boss fights. Mostly they have well-designed attacks and patterns. While some can be tricky and a little frustrating, the systems at play and your defensive options ensure that learning to fight these enemies properly is satisfying and rewarding. Although the red attacks that many enemies use are perhaps not the best part of the game, which leads to the biggest issue with combat, which is that it can sometimes feel like it's just a bit up to the AI roulette. Does the enemy use their red attacks a lot? Well, then that raises the skill floor in a fight significantly. Do they use them as mix-ups in their combos? Well, you're definitely gonna get sucker punched by these a few times. Does the enemy end up spamming attacks that make them hard to approach during the window where they're vulnerable to staggering? Well, you're probably not gonna get that stagger, so you can expect the fight to take longer and be a bit harder. When the combat is otherwise so tightly skill-based and rewarding, this level of unpredictability drags it down. The combat is still excellent though, even if the enemies sometimes make it more frustrating than it needs to be. The feedback on hits in particular is incredibly punchy and satisfying. Meanwhile, your own varied options collide with the enemies present to create a combat sandbox that remains interesting and is constantly evolving. There's always some new enemy type or challenge to get used to, and your tools are varied enough that you'll always have the option to explore different approaches and builds. And speaking of builds, there's fairly good character customization, mechanically anyway. Visually, you mostly just get a choice of a handful of outfits. But for the mechanics, you have a pretty standard Souls-like leveling system where each level up gets you a stat point. Then you have a skill tree where you slot gems into these nodes to fill them up. These gems provide small bonuses on their own, and filling up nodes grants additional bonuses, allowing you to choose from a wide variety of possible benefits. While the effects aren't always as impactful as I'd like, it still provides choice and variety that can be enjoyable and make your experience feel like your own. And then of course there's also the choice of your weapon and your Legion arm. The game's biggest recurring issue, I think, is just that there are a lot of systems that simply feel superfluous and don't add much to the game. There's a system where you can summon specters, but only NPCs and only for bosses. They're not especially scarce either, you get tons of the item needed to summon them, you're in no danger of running out of it. I guess it serves as a difficulty option for bosses, but mostly it just feels like it's here because Dark Souls had summons. The zones are interconnected, but they're arranged so linearly that it almost feels unnecessary to have them connect to each other. However, I will say that the areas are quite good to explore individually, with plenty of interwoven paths and a preference for shortcuts over just having more checkpoints. There's a weapon durability and sharpening system that's also kind of pointless. You have plenty of durability and can restore it at any time with your grindstone. I think they were going for a Monster Hunter thing, but Monster Hunter has your weapons gradually weaken as durability drops, and is focused on prolonged fights. Sharpening your weapon there is a matter of timing and strategy. It adds to the game's tempo much like reloading does in a game with a gun. Do you wait to sharpen and accept that you'll have lower damage output until you do, or do you take the risk to try and sharpen as soon as possible? But here, you'll just occasionally have to sharpen your weapon if you forget it for long enough. Even bosses rarely have enough health that your durability will be at any risk of running out first. It's much more like durability in Dark Souls 3, which you probably forgot was even in that game, and that is exactly my point. Likewise underbaked is the weapon creation system, which is a shame because I really wanted to like this. There's some cases where you can make a better weapon by combining pieces from two others, but a lot of the time I found myself using weapons in the same assembly they came in. Not helped by the fact that the blades aren't exactly balanced. The main reason you change the blade is for better stats or for a better fable art, and there's not a lot of complex trade-offs or anything. And since you have to invest in upgrading the weapon blades, you don't really have the option of constantly swapping them to use what's best for the situation anyway. There's a resource called Gold Coin Fruit that you earn over time after a certain point in the game. Their uses are weirdly niche though, and it would honestly not affect things if you could just do the things you spend them on freely. Making any of these free to use wouldn't make the player that much stronger. Nor would removing them entirely make them that much weaker. Finally, there's gestures for some reason. Combined with the Spectre summoning system, this makes me think they had plans for multiplayer at some point, but scrapped it and left the things in because, hey, Dark Souls. None of these systems are bad in a way that makes your experience directly worse from engaging with them, but they just don't feel like they add anything substantial either. Most of the time I just forget about them. It feels like these systems could have either been fleshed out further or the time on them spent on something more useful. But while Lies of P may have a fair bit of dead weight, it's still a fundamentally great Souls-like. Maybe it isn't as innovative as some, but what it lacks in innovation it makes up for in refinement. And it is still different enough to provide a whole new experience. A better YouTube creator than I described the Souls series as an open-ended question, and that finding your answer is where the magic happens. I couldn't agree more or put it better, which is why I'm paraphrasing him here. Learning these games as I play them is a key part of the experience to me, to the point where Dark Souls and Elden Ring are losing their luster to me. Lies of P may feel familiar, but it gives me its own set of tools and problems to solve, combined with some of the better Souls-like combat out there, and you have an excellent game if you need that Souls-like itch scratched and want something pretty similar to From Software's offerings, but maybe didn't really care for the open world in Elden Ring. And our last full review for this episode is Cocoon. Weird and artsy moth game? I'm in! Okay, but seriously though, this game fascinated me when I saw the trailers with its mind-bending multi-world puzzles and beautifully surreal visuals. Now that I've finally played it, it is a wonderfully chill puzzle game. The game teaches its mechanics well, gradually introducing them in logical ways. It helps that the game's controls are so simple you could fit them on an old Atari 2600 joystick. Ignoring the menus, the only inputs you have are movement and a single interact button, so you won't generally get stuck on puzzles because you didn't think to hit the right button on the right thing. It's much more about arranging an ever-expanding selection of moving parts in order to progress, rather than any sort of guesswork. This does lead to a little bit of running back and forth, but I never really minded. The game's chill atmosphere and beautiful worlds made this just a part of the experience to me. And while the multi-world concept sounds like it could get overwhelming, it's actually fairly well managed. I'm reminded of Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story in terms of its implementation. I know that feels like a long reach, but follow me here. While you may have access to multiple worlds at once, you generally are only able to progress through one at a time. The others instead will mostly be used for the orbs that contain them, or your progress through them will give you access to something within them that is useful to solving puzzles. It ensures that even when the world hopping gets a bit mind-bending, you're never given too much to handle. And I think what's most impressive here is how this game maintains this quality throughout. It's constantly adding new components to the puzzles. Sometimes these elements stay until the end, sometimes they're temporary additions, and yet the game does a good job ensuring you understand these elements and how they fit together. And this keeps the puzzle solving extremely satisfying. If there's one thing I can see being an issue for some people, it's the game is a bit on the short side. It took me around 4 hours and I was a bit distracted while playing. To some players, this might be too short to spend $25 on. I don't really mind. I mean, I got it on sale at launch for $20, which is about what I'd pay for a ticket to a movie that's half as long as this game. But if this is an issue for you, then you should probably wait for a sale. Or play it on Game Pass. If you're already subscribed to Game Pass, the price isn't an issue and it's a great game to spend an afternoon playing through. Really, this is a game in the tradition of titles such as the Eco series, Journey, and most recently Stray. An artsy sort of puzzle game with a focus on just incredible atmosphere. Certainly not games for everyone, but I'd say Cocoon is a worthy entry in this tradition. Even its short length isn't really that much of an issue in context. These games tend to be short but sweet experiences. So if you want a short, satisfying, and utterly beautiful puzzle game, give Cocoon a shot. And now for the rapid fire bonus round. Just a few games that I want to say something about, but don't have a whole long spiel on. First up, Starfield, just because I feel like someone would point it out if I didn't mention it. It just isn't for me, though. I was never going to be that into it, so any deeper criticism I could give it would probably just be disingenuous. I played it for like 2 sessions and got bored. It seems very much just like another Bethesda game but in space. There's some cool bits to it. I like how the city areas look. But then I spent a few hours digging through monotonous space dungeons and fighting space raiders. Sorry, I mean space pirates. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth by saying if you love the Bethesda formula, you'll love this one too, but I can safely say the inverse is true. If you don't care for or are just tired of Skyrim and Fallout 4's formula, this won't change your mind about it. In fact, the way they move it to space just arguably makes it worse. The locations you explore feel far more bland and meaningless. At least with Skyrim and Fallout 4, you could generally say, this is a place that it exists for such and such purpose. Next is Payday 3, which I don't want to do a full review on because it just is unfinished. There's technical problems and certain areas in which there's just not enough content. It was never going to match the amount of content of Payday 2 after like 10 years of DLC, but there's just too many holes to ignore here. However, despite this, the mechanical foundation is greatly improved. Heists are the best they have been, combining the cinematic style of the first game, the more open sandbox of the second game, and adding in more elaborate mechanics that support both. I want to give this a proper review when it's in a better state. I can't recommend it as it is now unless you're playing it for free on Game Pass, but it does have potential if it's fixed. And lastly, Pikmin 4, which was pretty fun. I'm mostly putting it here because this review is a little late, and I don't really have too much to say on this, but I needed a third thing to fill this section. The game's biggest strength is the way it includes elements of basically every version of Pikmin gameplay. There's a lot of fun to be had here. In particular, I quite love the mode that lets you play through a campaign styled after the first Pikmin game, a limited amount of time to collect 30 ship parts. I'd say its main problems are both being a bit overburdened with content that isn't always that satisfying, and also feeling a bit too easy and simplified in areas. But the game is a good buffet of Pikmin fun. While I do think the other games are better, especially as a place to start for new fans, it's always nice to see one of Nintendo's less used IPs get some love. And with those done, man, this was a great month or so for games, huh? Some of them had issues, and not all of them were really to my tastes, but I still found quite a few games to love. A nice boost to the year after a pretty slow summer. And the next few months seem pretty packed as well. I've got quite a few other topics I want to cover, but hopefully I'll get another video like this one done by the end of the year. But what did you think? Any games I missed that you think more people need to play? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you all in the next video.